Now it's official.
Oh, there's a bit of a go.
Yeah, I'm gonna move over to here. And I'll let our IT guy, Julian, work on whatever issues arise. So I'm Ann Dahlke. I'm the current chapter president. And you want me there?
Yeah, it's better.
Oh, okay. And I should take direction pretty well here. So we have a couple things going on in our chapter. Recently, we hired a new project manager, and I've been spending a lot of time with him, he's from San Diego, so he hasn't experienced the local habitat area. So we've been hiking all over the peninsula and also brainstorming and what we're going to do. And the thing I'm most excited about right now, and I think Jess will be real happy to hear this, several years ago, the Rolling Hills Preparatory School made an agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to manage habitat for the endangered Palos Verde blue butterfly that lives right behind their campus, and a few other places too. And the program kind of fell apart during COVID, but it's starting up again. Our new project manager, his name is Keith, has a lot of good ideas on this, and we're resurrecting the whole project, getting it up and running. So we'll be doing a lot of work in preparation for it this summer, and then in the fall, start getting the kids to be involved in the program. Okay, I had something else. So the other thing is, I'm very excited about tonight's program. I like more ecological oriented issues. And Natasha, your last name, please.
Khanna.
Huh? Khanna. So sorry about that, because I was having a hard time. There it is. And she really worked hard. We provided some funds for her master's project, and it involved going all over Southern California, investigating how Southern California walnut trees are utilized by the local animal community, in particular birds. And this is really, really interesting, and I hope you will enjoy it. I didn't bring anything really wonderful and wondrous for you, because I just really want to hear what Natasha has to say. So, are you all ready? Natasha, are you ready? I'm excited about this. And
Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Natasha, and I just oh wait, sorry.
Put this on your collar, and it will go into the recording. Fingers are different. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, hi everybody. My name is Natasha, and I just graduated from Cal State LA yesterday. And today I will be presenting my master's thesis research on the ecological value of California walnut woodlands to avifauna. And I primarily work out of the Wood Lab of Avian and Urban Ecology, and Dr. Eric M. Wood is my advisor. So just a quick fun activity. If you could see, can you guys see the birds, the bird in the tree? Does anyone know what bird that is?
This is something yellow. I think something yellow.
Did we turn the light down a bit?
So yes, it is a warbler. Getting close.
A yellow one?
It's an orange crown warbler.
Yeah.
So we have an orange crown warbler feeding in a Southern California black walnut tree. Okay, so I'm gonna just give you a roadmap of what I'm gonna go over. First, I'm gonna give you background on California walnut woodlands and birds. Then I'm gonna talk about my research goals and objectives, my methods, and then my results and the discussion. So pretty much like an outline of a scientific article. So what's a California walnut woodland? So here you have a picture of it. But basically the definition according to the California Native Plant Society is any woodland plant community where more than half of the cover is Southern California black walnut tree or a combination of Southern California black walnut with coast live oak. So if more than half of the tree canopy cover is made up of these two trees, then it is a California walnut woodland. Other plant associations that you can find in a California walnut woodland include Toyon, blue elderberry, and Laurel sumac. And I want to give you some background. So this habitat primarily occurs in Southern California in rolling hills, and they actually overlap with a lot of different types of habitats, including oak woodlands, coastal sage scrub, and riparian corridors and chaparral. So here's a map that shows you the distribution of the of this woodland community that also includes the tree. So it can go as far north as San Luis Obispo County, all the way down the coast to San Diego County, and as far east as the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains. Now, somebody asked me in another meeting, like, does it go into Baja California? I actually don't know for sure, but because Baja California is part of the California Floristic Province, most likely it does, but I've never gone there and I don't know much about the habitat over there. So yeah, it's kind of weird that the range just ends right at the border, and that's probably because that's
Because of the wall.
the wall. Well, it's also based on who's doing the research. So I also want to give you some background on the namesake tree, the Southern California black walnut tree. So it's endemic to Southern California. It is threatened. It is considered rare on the CNPS rare plant list. It is culturally significant to the Gabrielino, Tongva, Quiche, and Chumash communities, and it's known as Takape Washut to the Tongva. And so if you think about this habitat, no one knows for sure, but I think a majority of its habitats since the beginning of colonization has been destroyed, first by agriculture and land grazing, now urbanization and climate change. And if you remember, just going back to this map, you can see that a majority of this habitat pretty much overlaps with highly urbanized areas of Southern California. So it would make sense that a lot of it is impacted by urbanization. So I also want to give you background about how I learned about this this topic. So I live in Northeast Los Angeles. I live in a community that is facing rising costs of housing. And there's also a lot of remnant black walnut woodland, California walnut woodland habitat. And what's happening in the community is a lot of developers are coming in, and maybe these areas were unaffordable to develop in the past, but now because of the housing market, it's become profitable to develop on these last remaining stands of California walnut woodland. And the local community that does comprise of a lot of low-income residents are actually organizing to save this habitat, but then also knowing that also with the understanding that protecting this habitat could also potentially stop the development of single unit luxury housing, and that could potentially lead to trends of displacement in the community. And since they were using a lot of groups are actually in litigation with developers in the area, and they are using a lot of the existing conservation regulations to try to protect the habitat. And I found that there's actually a lack of research on the ecology to wildlife for wildlife in California walnut woodlands. And so here you have a picture of the Takape Washut Black Walnut Day Committee, which is a coalition of a lot of different organizations coming together to map the walnut woodland stands in Northeast LA, along with gentrification and community organizing. So why study birds? I think maybe a lot of people in the room already know this, but let's just go over it. Los Angeles sits within a biodiversity hotspot. LA County is the birdiest county in all of the United States, which year after year, sometimes San Diego County beats us, but what that pretty much means is that mostly year after year, we usually have the highest number of bird species observed in any county in the United States. Also, birds can be considered an indicator species to understand the health of an ecosystem. And this map here is showing you migratory pathways, and we are located along the Pacific flyway. So we are on a major pathway for birds to come through. And so I thought it would be important to understand how this habitat is, how is this habitat important to birds? So here is a really cool map that was created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to just show you the migratory patterns of birds. Each dot that you see on the map represents a species, one species of birds and their migratory path. So right now, as the colors change, it's yellow. So we could say this is fall. You can see the birds are migrating down south for the winter. And then, you know, as spring approaches, they start to migrate up north. They go to their spring and summer nesting grounds where they breed. And they spend depending on the species, spends the spring and summer in their breeding grounds, and then come back down in the fall and winter down south. And that's why it's really important to I just want to just show this just for those people who are not familiar with bird migratory patterns. And I just want to say, you'll notice that a lot of these dots are actually mostly on the East Coast, east of the Mississippi River, and that's because that's where a lot of research has been done. There's very few dots that pass through California, and this is just representative of the lack of research. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about my research goal and objectives. So my main goal was to quantify the ecological significance of California walnut woodland habitat to birds in LA County along an urban to natural gradient. So I had 3 objectives. I'm going to just read through it and walk you through them. So my first objective was to quantify the composition of trees, shrubs, and birds in 8 sampling sites that had California walnut woodland habitat. My second objective was to quantify the relationships between the different components of the plant community during the spring and fall periods of the annual cycle. So pretty much that map that I showed you 1 year, an annual cycle of the bird species. My third goal was to quantify the feeding behavior of birds during the spring and fall periods to distinct tree and shrub species. So now I'm going to I'll walk you through the methods of my research. So I had 8 sampling sites, and I wanted them to fall along an urban to natural gradient to see if I could identify any patterns with birds. So let me just get the laser pointer going. Is it working? No. Okay, so here, my East Canyon is my most rural site, which is located close to Santa Clarita in Newhall, and it lies in between the Santa Susana Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains. And then my suburban sites were in San Gabriel Valley and Pomona Valley. So we have South Hills in Glendora, Galster in West Covina, and Powder Canyon Open Space Preserve in the Puente Hills. And I just want to note that Galster was a pretty cool site, and it's also next to a toxic landfill, unremediated landfill. And then my most urban sites were actually in Northeast Los Angeles, which was El Rio Canyon Park and Debs Park. And then I had these 2 very interesting sites, which was Williker Park and Griffith Park, which are in the within the city of Los Angeles, but they are in the Santa Monica Mountains, and they pretty much are connected through corridors to larger open spaces. So they have both rural and natural and urban components to them. So I'm going to talk about my field surveys. So I did tree and shrub surveys. I did one survey per site, and I identified the tree and shrubs, and I counted their stems, and I made sure to specifically count and measure trees and shrubs that were taller than 2 meters. And let me just backtrack a little bit and say that I'll occasionally use the word overstory plants. And I know this is a forester term to specifically refer to trees only, but because in Southern California, we don't really have forests. We have mostly like this woodland habitat that's like open space with trees and large shrubs that sometimes act like trees in terms of the habitat that they provide for birds. So I'm just using that term to describe a modified overstory plants. And I made sure to specifically identify trees and shrubs that were taller than 2 meters because that's what I found the birds to be foraging on, and that's what I could observe within my study. So I did 5 surveys per site for birds, and you might be wondering why do one survey for trees per site and then 5 surveys for birds per site. And that is because I wanted to be able to capture both resident and migratory bird species. You know, so we'll have different species that will come and stay with us in the spring and summer when they nest, and we'll have other species that come and stay with us in the winter and fall. During the colder temperatures, they come from up north, and then we also have species that are with us all year round. And that's why I did 5 surveys. I made sure to document the birds to their species, and I wasn't just counting every single bird that I saw in the habitat. I was actually specifically counting birds that were foraging on the trees and shrubs, and I would make sure to note which species of trees and shrubs they were foraging on, and also even the substrate. So meaning, were they flying and eating insects off the leaves? Were they eating insects off the bark or the branches? Or maybe they were eating fruits and seeds of the different plants. And I designed my own app with an ArcGIS Esri app called Survey 123 to collect all my data. So in order to achieve my first objective, which was to figure out what was the composition of trees and birds, I took all the tree and shrub data, and I pretty much used the I used a method to calculate importance values to figure out how important each tree was on the landscape. So I used a formula that took a combination of frequency and also basal area to calculate that. And that helps you figure out density and abundance of trees and shrubs on the landscape. And then for the bird observations, I made sure to identify birds by site, like what site did I see them at, and then also to figure out if they were residents, migrants, and also understand what information about their conservation needs. And I'm really interested in understanding how urban density is impacting birds in this habitat. So I used parcel data, which is data you can get from the County of Los Angeles. It's the way the county taxes residents, and you can actually use that to figure out how many buildings exist across the County of Los Angeles. And I used ArcGIS Pro, so I used software to calculate two buffer extents. The first buffer extent was the 287 meter buffer. So that's pretty much the home range of a scrub jay, which you see here in this picture. So a home range is just like how far the bird will fly from where it's nesting. How far will a bird go? And we guessed pretty much that this bird had the longest home range of any bird species within my study. And what I used with this buffer is that I counted the number of buildings within a 287 meter radius. And I wanted to figure out if local neighborhood urban attributes was having any impact on the birds. And then I had a 10-kilometer buffer. And I wanted to just understand if perhaps like just density, urban density was having an influence on birds and the habitat. So for my second objective, which is to understand the relationship between environmental attributes and bird foraging behavior, I did use statistical analysis. I used general linear models. And specifically, I use negative binomial regressions, which is like a statistical analysis tool you use for count data. I did find that I had one outlier site, Elria Canyon Park. It was like it was really impacting the rest of my data. It was over dispersing it. So I had to remove it. And I think it's because it was a very, very small site in comparison to my other sites, like area wise. And then I used the Kullback-Leibler divergence based value. It's a way to assess model fitness. So it's kind of like adjusted R-squares values. And then for my predictor variables, I had natural and non-natural attributes. So that includes native plant counts, non-native plant counts, plant species richness, and my non-natural attribute was the urban parcel density that I just spoke about. And my response variables was bird counts and species richness. So for those of you who might not have taken a stats class or it's been a long time, what this means is like my predictor variables, I'm trying to figure out if like the number of native plants or the number of non-native plants are impacting bird counts or impacting species richness. So species richness means the number of bird species. And that for plant species richness, that means the number of plant species. And in order to quantify the tree and shrub used for foraging birds, I calculated feeding percentages, I calculated preference and aversion values. And pretty much what a preference and aversion value is just like taking the percentage of each species of the birds feeding on each tree and then figuring out and comparing that to the importance value and then figuring out if it was a negative or positive. Like if I subtract the feeding percentage from the importance values, do I get a negative or positive number? And that will determine whether they preferred or had an aversion to specific tree or shrub species. So now I'm going to walk you through the results for each of my objectives. So for my first objectives, okay, what are the trees and shrubs in a California walnut woodland? I observed over 17,000 tree and shrubs, and I calculated the importance value. So now I'm going to share with you the top 3 species. There was actually 49 species of trees, and I just didn't want to list all of them. So I don't know, let's just guess. What do you think would be in my top 5 trees? Oak, okay, somebody said oak. So Toyon. Anybody else? Any other guesses? Huh? Madrone? Acacia, okay. Oops, sorry. Okay, you didn't see that. Never mind. That was only on my side. Okay, okay, yeah. So I'll just say this much that out of the 49 species that I identified, more than half of them were non-native, but 85% of the cover, okay, was native. Okay, so most of our habitat is still native, and here we have the results. One second. Okay, so the most abundant tree was Southern California black walnut, followed by coast live oak, and then we have Toyon coming in 3rd, Laurel sumac 4th, and blue elderberry 5th. These are the most dominant and abundant plants that I had found on the landscape. So now I'm going to talk about what are the birds? What were the birds that I was finding? That was like the big question. What's feeding on the habitat? So first of all, I had over 1,000 observations of birds. Sorry, it says tree and shrub. It should say bird observations. I found 49 species of foraging in the habitat. 48 out of 49 were native species. I found 28 that are year-round residents. 11 species are breeding species that come in the spring and summer. 8 are non-breeding species that come visit in the fall and the winter. And 2 are migratory species that are just passing through during their migration. So, okay, now I'm going to tell you what the top 6 are. So let's take a guess. What do you think? What do you think are on there? Scrub jay. Okay, we got orange crown warbler, scrub jay,
Northern mockingbird,
northern mockingbird,
yellow crown.
yellow crown,
Sorry, not mockingbird. Yellow rump.
yellow rump warbler. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know how to get the chat. I can't see the chat on here. So I don't know what people are saying.
Be quiet in the chat.
Okay, these are the top 6 species that I found. Bush tits are number 1. Yellow rumped warbler, number 2. And let me just say, they come in the fall. A lot of studies are done in the spring. If I would not have included the fall surveys, I would not have found yellow rump at the top of my list. Oak tit mouse, they're a declining species, which means that, well, they are abundant when you find them in their habitat, but the habitat is shrinking because of human impacts. Followed by blue-gray gnatcatcher, California towhee, and the endemic Nuttall's woodpecker. And then, okay, so what were the other ones? Scrub jay was on my list. Somebody said orange crown warbler, that was on my list. Yellow, what else? Did I hear? Mockingbird? No, I did not see any mockingbirds. I feel like they're more of a
Or urban.
urban. Yes, yeah, they were not there. Okay, so now let's talk about objective 2. To figure out if there was any significant relationships between environmental attributes and bird foraging behaviors. So I had 26 models. I'm not going to walk you through every single one of them. I'm just going to highlight 6 key models. So first, I found that there was a strong relationship between non-native tree shrub count and total bird feeding count. So what does that mean? So we have on the x-axis here, non-native tree shrub count. And on the y-axis, we have feeding bird count. So as non-native tree shrub count increases, bird feeding count goes down. Okay, and I want to point out here that my R-square value is 0.71. So what that means is that 71% of the model likelihood is explained by this model. That's very, very high. Usually in stats, if you get a value of 0.3 or 0.4, you're really happy. But 0.7, that's really, really high. And the p-value, just for those who need a refresher, it means that I can say with 99.9% confidence that this is how confident I am with this model. So for my next model, I wanted to figure out what is the relationship between native tree and shrub richness and bird feeding richness. So here we have on the x-axis the number of native tree and shrub species. So as the number of native and tree and shrub species increases, so does the number of bird species increases. So we have a positive relationship here. And here again, a very high R-square value of 0.55. And now I wanted to also see if there was any significant relationships between any of those top 5 tree and shrub species that I was talking about. And I found that blue elderberry had a very, very high, had a very strong, is very statistically significant. And I found here that as the count of blue elderberry goes up, so does the count of feeding birds in the spring. And actually it was the same for fall and spring, but I'm just highlighting spring in this model. Now I'm looking here at native tree and shrub richness and spring feeding bird richness. So as native tree and shrub counts, species counts goes up, so does spring feeding bird richness. And this is very high, 0.80, one of my highest R-square values. And here I am highlighting coast live oak. So the relationship between coast live oak and fall feeding bird count. So as the number of coast live oak tree counts goes up, so does the number of fall feeding bird counts. And here finally, my final model that I want to highlight is this urban density model. So here we have on the x-axis the number of parcels. And, there's a lot of parcels in LA County, so the number on the x-axis is very high. And on the y-axis, we have the fall feeding bird count. So as the number of buildings increases, the number of birds goes down. And here is my natural to urban gradient. So here we have East Canyon, the most rural site that I had in Newhall, Santa Clarita area, and Debs Park in Northeast Los Angeles had the lowest feeding count. And we can see here the sites are impacted by urbanization. I also want to note that I had no significant models for my 287 buffer models, which actually is an interesting thing. What this means to me is that actually that the local urban density around our patches, around our habitat, is not necessarily negatively or positively impacting the birds. That means that they are able to survive in these patches, even though there is like housing surrounding the patches. And I think this is really important to highlight for small patches, because that means it's important to save the last remaining small patches that we have left, because they can serve as important habitat for birds. And then my final objective was to quantify tree and shrubs used by foraging birds. So like which trees and shrubs are being used in higher proportions by different birds. So here, I don't know if you noticed from the last results, but black walnut did not come as important. I only highlighted coast live oak and elderberry, and that was very disappointing. But then when I look at species richness, meaning the number of bird species using each shrub of my top 5 trees, I found that black walnut had the highest use. It was used by 36 species of birds, followed by coast live oak, Toyon, blue elderberry, and then western sycamore with 13 species of birds. And now I want to, this is like my final figure, and I'm going to walk you through here. There's a lot going on here. Here, I wanted to compare, what I'm doing is comparing how each of the top 5 trees that in terms of importance values, how are they being used? What are the feeding percentages? So here we have on the green bar on the left is the relative importance value. So that was like that first slide I showed you to show you what are the top 5 important trees on the landscape. So which is Southern California walnut, coast live oak, Toyon, Laurel, sumac, and blue elderberry. And then what I have, the 3 bars on the right are actually feeding percentages. So the brown bar shows the total feeding percentage. And so when you compare the green to the brown bar, if the green bar is higher, that means and the brown bar is lower, that means they're not feeding on it as much as it is available on the landscape. But here for coast live oak, you see that the brown bar is taller than the green bar. And that means that birds are feeding in higher proportion on coast live oak than it is available. So if you look at this here, we see that actually blue elderberry and coast live oak are used in in a higher proportion than it is available by birds. And then what we have here for the purple and orange bars is like this seasonal feeding percentages. So purple is the spring feeding percentage and orange is the fall feeding percentage. And when we compare, I want to note here coast live oak. So coast live oak is heavily used in the spring. It's used way more than it is in the fall. Just so is Toyon, it's used more in the spring. And then actually Laurel sumac is used heavily in the fall, and so is blue elderberry. I also want to point out that even though the orange, purple, and the brown, orange, and purple bars for coast live for Southern California walnut are shorter than the importance value, they are still being used much more than the other 43 species on my list. So now I'm going to walk you through the conclusion. So California walnut woodlands are ecologically important to native birds. That was like my goal. That's what I wanted to prove with my research. They support a wide variety of native habitat. A majority are, I also found this was a revelation for me, a majority of the woodland is native and it has ecotonal qualities. This is not something that I actually saw right away, but like, and I think it's because so much of our landscape has been altered by humans. But I found there was like large overlap. I found a high diversity of different plants in the habitat and a high diversity of birds. And you know, there's overlap with chaparral, with coastal sage scrub, California grasslands species, and riparian. And so like if I had to imagine what did the landscape look like pre-colonization, I think in our flat areas, we had a lot of wetlands and grasslands. And then as we would go and transition to higher elevations to rolling hills, we would have we would transition through California walnut woodlands, and then at higher elevations, more into chaparral and coastal sage scrub. And then I found that overstory vegetation is really important to birds and bird biodiversity. That's why I wanted to focus on trees and shrubs, and that's because a lot of the understory plants has been altered. You know, once upon a time, pre-colonization, the understory was probably all native forbs and grasses, and now it's mostly entirely invasive annual grasses. Yeah, like brassica, like mustard, and oats. And also, like, I think it's really important to do more studies across seasons, you know, not just focus on a spring and summer survey, you know, include a fall survey, because I had this idea in my mind that the birds must be using the trees and shrubs differently based on what's fruiting and what's flowering. So a lot of our plants and they flower in the fall, in the spring and in the spring, and they fruit in the fall. So I wanted to be able to see how the birds were using it differently. And then urban density strongly impacts birds in California walnut woodlands. So yeah, basically California walnut woodland is critically important ecosystem. I do think it is imperiled because of all the development we have in Southern California. I also want to just say that this, so we really need to conserve it. This research was directly inspired by Takape Washu Black Walnut Day Committee. Shout out to everyone who is here on Zoom from the committee, and to those who attended in person. I really wanted to, when I started my grad program, I really wanted to find the intersections of social justice or environmental justice with ecology. I found that ecology is not always intersectional. And then I'm living in Northeast LA, and found out about this work that was doing in the community to keep low-income residents in the community, to fight against gentrification, and then also support communities who are stewarding the land. And finally, I want to say, let's do more community-inspired research. I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Wood, my classmates, Harnawaz and Jessica, who helped me with the bird surveys, my thesis committee members, Dr. Aguilar and Dr. Wright. And also I'd like to thank Palos Verdes Audubon for all their support, along with Cal State LA, CNPS LA, Pasadena Audubon, Santa Monica Bay Audubon for all their financial support so I could complete my research. And finally, questions.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Somebody asked a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I actually have two questions.
Uh-huh.
One is, what's next for you? And the other is, what were the primary non-native trees and shrubs that you found?
Okay, so should I repeat the questions? Okay, so what's next for me? I need a job, you guys. I need to pay my bills, so I'll be looking for work. I want to work in this field. I want to work as an ecologist or biologist and do more conservation work. The second question was, what was the non-native trees? Most significant ones, I would want to say like eucalyptus. And I actually didn't identify all the eucalyptus species, so I just categorized it all as a genus. I'm not very familiar with the eucalyptus trees. That was like one very common one. But honestly, they're very, very small percentage of my, I think it was like something like 89% of the canopy cover is native. You know, and I found the non-native species mostly on the fringes, like at trailheads, by the parking lots, by picnic areas. Yeah, so, and along trails, like where humans go and do management. Yeah. Okay, I have another question.
Yes, I was interested in in the Griffith Park. As an outlier on virtually all
Oh.
of those.
Yes,
Studies.
yes, Jesse, that is
Wonder,
such a good observation of yours.
Is that equivalent to the Elyria Canyon? I
Ele-
was wondering.
Okay, so yeah, so here we have, okay, Griffith Park is this green one. It's an outlier. It's standing out here with this model here. It's standing out here in this model. Like I wasn't sure, like I was very curious. Williker and Griffith, like these are the two sites that have both native urban and supernatural qualities about them. You know what was going on there, and I consulted with my advisors, and we think that these parks, you know, in the Hollywood Hills, they probably have a lot of money, and they might be being managed by the Parks and Recs folks in a certain way that is impacting it. But that's just all speculation. I really don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But in terms of like if the data point was similar to how the Elyria Canyon Park was, no, Elyria Canyon, I think it would be it would be an outlier. Like all the dots would be in this one general area, and then Elyria would be up here, and then it would create a curve like this for me. Or it would be, or if it would create a quadratic curve, or if all the dots were up here, then Elyria would be down here. And I don't know what it was about Elyria. I think it was just too small. Like if I had to do another research topic, it would be good to like maybe gather a bunch of sampling sites in similar size, you know, and then see if there were any patterns. But I do think, you know, just for, I don't know, anyone here from Black Walnut Day who's familiar with Elyria Canyon, it is a park where a lot of people from Black Walnut Day, people do restoration. There's a nursery there. I think it's a magical place. I think it's a magical place because there's so much there's such a high diversity of birds and plants, even though it's like surrounded by housing. And that's why I wanted to include it in there, because I wanted a small patch, because that's the type of patches that I saw people, the size of patches people were trying to save. So, but it wasn't working with my models. So here it is, Griffith Park, an outlier. And then, well, it's down here, so it worked with the urban density model. Any other, okay, go ahead.
Since you don't count, you don't have a winter survey in here, I'm wondering how that might affect the data for Toyon in particular, which has such a high fruit
Yeah,
concentration.
this bird here, this is not from the study. This is a scarlet tanager. And my partner, he took a picture of this scarlet tanager in Griffith Park in January. So that's outside my survey time. I just, yeah, I think so. That's what summer tanager. Yeah, summer tanager. I think I think probably, let me just, if I can show you this. Sorry, I have to go like this. If you notice, like my fall results are all like consistently low, except for this. I wonder if it would have changed the results here. And I had really predicted that Toyon would be highly used in the fall versus the spring, but it's specifically eating the berries. But I felt like I had to spend a lot of time standing in front of a Toyon bush to watch the bird actually eat the berry, and I didn't have time to spend like 10 minutes under one bush to see that behavior. I also wonder about like I just wonder about like the study design in terms of, it's so easy to stand underneath an oak tree and look at the birds, or a walnut tree, but I can't really see what's going inside the Toyon or the Laurel sumac shrub, because it's a shrub and it's not a tree, and there's such dense foliage. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think
I think it would be different. I think I would get different results. Yes. Yeah.
What you can possibly do and what
Yeah, what can I do in 2 years so I can graduate on time?
Oh, dear.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
these days, there's a lot of talk about wildlife corridors,
Mm-hmm.
and so much of our urban housing has non-natives. But I keep thinking about getting wildlife corridors built within the urban landscape to have native plants. If, yeah, in your wildest dreams, if you get all these wildlife corridors established with the oak trees and the, all the other ones, you know, the walnut and all the other fun stuff out there. What can you envision happening with the wildlife, birds, wildlife?
Well, I do think a lot of birds use people's backyards, even if it has non-native habitat or plants on it. I mean, I'm sure you all know this as birders. I don't know how, should I repeat the question? I'm not sure how to repeat that question.
No, I think we got it.
Okay, you got it? Okay. I know as birders, you must be familiar with like birding in the parking lot. I found like sometimes birding in the parking lot, I found way more bird species in the parking lot than when I actually went inside the patches. And I think that's because there's different types of trees. It's called edge effect, right? So on the edges of these native habitats, we have humans planting other types of plants that non-native plants that birds will use in different ways. So I don't know. I'm not sure when you say corridors for little backyards, I'm not sure how what that means exactly.
So say you have native habitat up on the Pillsbury Peninsula,
Mm-hmm.
and then you go up to, you know, one of your sites, Debs or one of the others,
Mm-hmm.
and between these two sites, there's nothing but concrete
Mhm.
and rose bushes and other non-native stuff. But if you can take little parkettes, median dividers, people's front yards, backyards, and get native plants into them,
Mm-hmm.
you could expand the habitat.
Yeah.
I've got a mostly native garden at my house,
Mm-hmm.
and I have about 12 to 15 regular visitors to the house, and it's a very tiny yard. Little
Mhm.
48 number.
So that would, are you saying that would, I think that would increase, based on my models, it would increase bird abundance and species richness in urban areas? Is that what you would guess? Yeah. Yeah. I think even though I didn't do, I mean, I don't know if you've read any of the articles by my advisor, Dr. Wood, but he has students who pretty much studied, he took they recruited residents, homeowners who had both native and non-native landscapes, and they studied bird abundance and pollinator abundance in their backyards. And I think they found that there was obviously more diversity and abundance of birds and pollinators in the native backyards, native landscape backyards. Yeah.
So I think this is a good way to expand habitat within our urban landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And we might have more fun with the birds and the walnut trees.
Yeah. I can't see, I don't know how to see the chat, if there's any questions in the chat.
None so far.
Okay. Okay, we have another question.
You were talking about it.
Uh-huh.
You say that they are indicated species.
Uh-huh.
When you say that, what do you mean? They reflect like environmental conditions, like habitat conditions, or like, you know, ecological ecosystem. What is?
From what I understand, like they can indicate if you have like a large abundance of birds, like both species richness and number of birds in an ecosystem. Like if you compare two sites and one has more abundance of birds and also more diversity of birds, that means that probably that ecosystem is much healthier. That patch is much healthier, the ecosystem in that patch compared to the other patch. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That's just like an idea, and then you study birds because they're like easy to see, And then if you look at food webs, you know, birds are feeding on insects, so that means there must be an abundance of insects, and they might be feeding in different parts of plants, so that means that there's healthy plants for them to feed on, and so on. And that means if there's insects and plants, that impacts the whole food web, you know, including lizards, reptiles. Yeah.
But that's mean like using like because of the presence, because of the absence, or because they are abundant.
It's just like an indicator, like it's just to indicate, just to get an idea of whether the ecosystem is healthy or not healthy.
Because in compared with what I do, like invertebrates,
Mhm.
bioindicators.
Oh,
So if you see like bleach, you can have abundance, but doesn't mean the ecosystem is healthy.
oh yeah, that's
Because the water
true.
quality is
Yes,
healthy.
yes,
Healthy.
yeah. It is true. You have to look at the type of species that you see on the habitat as well. Yeah.
I'm not very good with birds.
Okay. Uh,
Speaking of birds, you seem to distinguish feeding birds from foraging birds and.
I
versus
was
other-
using,
versus other birds?
I was just using the term feeding or foraging birds interchangeably. Is that what you were asking?
Opposed to other birds that don't.
Well, specifically birds that are feeding on the trees and shrubs, you know, versus like a like for example, let me just say, like I did see goldfinches occasionally, but they are on my list. But just as an example, they're associated with grasslands, you know.
You
So-
were looking at raptors first.
Yeah, I wasn't looking at raptors, so they're not foraging off the insects, you know, or like a grass plant species like a song sparrow that you'll see mostly feeding off the grass, but not necessarily off of a tree or a shrub.
This is something like, it's like, I want your opinion with idea. Let's say you have a place and there is so many invasive plants and native plants.
Mhm.
Weeds. So if somebody tell you to remove all the invasive weeds, do you think it will affect the birds population or the birds
Have to repeat
habitat?
the ones.
Okay, so the question is that if there's a habitat that has native plants and invasive plants, if we remove all the invasive plants, will it affect the bird population? That's the question. Yeah, I do think that changing the habitat in whatever way you decide to change it is going to impact bird populations, depending on what you do. I think that I would have to speculate here, but if I had to do a study, I would guess that by removing all the invasive, non-native plants, and you would get more diversity of native birds using the habitat potentially. It depends also what you replace the habitat with too. So if you're going to replace, yeah, so that's the other question. What kind of habitat are you replacing it with too? You know, if you're going to just like, if in my study area, if you're going to just replace it with trees and shrubs, you're just going to get native trees and shrubs. You're just going to get more of the same types of birds, I'm guessing. But if you replace it, for example, with native grassland, you're going to get a whole different type of group of birds that feed off of grasslands.
If they say like chrysanthemums, there is a monoculture.
Uh-huh.
So my idea is what can we remove? Do we pull out all the chrysanthemums, pull out some birds?
So your question is, if we remove all the chrysanthemums from where exactly? From,
Let's say it's smaller.
I mean, it really depends on what was there. You have to first know what was the historical habitat. What was the habitat there before? You know, that's first you have to ask that question, and then you have to figure out what is using it now. Yeah, so it's not such a simple answer. Go ahead.
When is the next Black Walnut Day? Where is it gonna come?
So I think the Black Walnut Day committee needs to meet soon and decide what they want to do next and what they have capacity for. I know people were very, very tired after the last one. They did a lot of activities. It was like I don't know, don't quote me on this, but 3 months worth of activities. And they have to really assess what we're gonna do this year. I don't know. Yeah.
Can we return to the slide with the bar graphs?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I felt, I didn't think I completely understood. I felt like there was some significance here that we were trying to emphasize, and I didn't know if, I mean, I guess especially between comparing like the relative important value,
Mhm.
importance value and the total feeding. I understood that like there were some species that were striking because there was more of a demand by the birds for its food, or like what kind of like nutrition it provided, that being like the oak and then the elderberry. But I think you were trying to emphasize something here with the black walnut. And
Yeah, so
and I was like I didn't know.
okay, so if you look at just comparing this green bar of Southern California black walnut to these other 3 bars, you see that actually, because these 3 bars are lower than the green one, birds are actually not feeding in higher proportion than it is available. They're feeding in a lower proportion on black walnut than it is available on the landscape. That's what it's showing. But they're still feeding on this more than they are feeding on Toyon. You see how these bars are taller than this one? And they're still feeding more on it, you know, than Laurel sumac, if you look at the total feeding, and blue elderberry.
Guess what my question was is that given the difference between the relative importance
Mm-hmm.
and then, you know, sort of how you were analyzing its importance based off its feeding, is there something that you are like suggesting here with the black walnut in terms of, like, I know when we first met, you were talking about keynote species, but you're like, the black walnut can't be necessarily considered a keynote, like
A keystone species.
a keystone species, but is that something that you're trying to draw out here? You're like, hey, it's very important, but it's not just about food. Maybe there's something like structural or essential to this ecosystem that you are.
Yeah, okay, so the question for the Zoom audience is, was I trying to say something about the Southern California black walnut, even though its importance value is higher than the feeding percentage? Was I trying to say that this was still important in some way? I think that's what you're asking me, that you're trying to understand what I was saying.
What's the
Yeah.
blue line interpretation?
Okay, yeah, so what is my interpretation of this? So when I was looking at the importance values, you know, when I compare it to like coast live oak, like I feel like when I was counting the black walnut trees on the habitat, there were so many more black walnut trees than oak trees, for example. But then the trees were so skinny. They're so skinny and they're like a shrubby bush. Whereas the coast live oak is so big. The basal area of a coast live oak is so big. So then even though there were so many more black walnut, coast live oak came in pretty high, even though there are so few compared to the black walnut. And so I do think that's why they're using the oak tree in higher proportion, maybe because they're such larger trees. But I also feel like the Southern California black walnut is just so prevalent on the landscape within my sampling sites that birds are using it. And then this here kind of shows that, so like, you know, it makes me, I was asking this question with my committee members, like, is this like a generalist, is this like, are birds like, it's like a generalist tree, like a tree that birds just generally use, like it's just there. There's so much of it there that you just end up using it, and it's just like a all around generally good tree. Whereas when you look at the other trees, like it's like they're really using, maybe birds are very, they want to use that, but it's not as available on the landscape. So, and you have to use it at different times depending on the season. And then black walnut is just being used both in the spring and the fall. but you see here, it's being used both in the spring and the fall comparatively the same, to similar proportions. The question is, I don't know. It's all speculation. Yeah. Did you have something to say, Emily?
I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so a lot of the birds that you had have small beaks. They look like they're insectivores.
Yes, they
Are
are.
they eating the insects on these trees?
Yes, most of the trees are insectivorous species of birds. So the foraging behaviors I would observe, like the most common one was like when they do like a flying maneuver where they're sitting on a branch and then they do a flying maneuver and grab an insect very close to the tree area or a branch. Then the other behavior I saw them doing, I saw Nuttall's woodpecker, for example, doing this a lot, is eating the bugs off the branch and the bark. So there's a lot of birds that do that. And then I would note that if they're eating off the branch, eating off the bark, sometimes they were just like foraging within the tree in the leaves for bugs versus flying. So I would note the leaf if they're eating off the leaf and then eating fruit as well. Yeah. And I will say that elderberry, it was not a mass year this year. I think across all my sites, I did not see a lot of elderberry trees with lots of fruit on them. And I hear that they have every 3-4 years like a mast year where they'll just produce like crazy. And it was not a mast year for elderberry. And I wonder if I would have collected during a mast year, what my results would be. Yeah.
Here's a question from the Zoom. Let's see if I can pull it up here.
Okay.
With all the information you've been explaining, what were the 3 big takeaways from your research that impacts the developers versus environmental justice struggle?
Okay, I'm reading it right now. So my big takeaway, which I couldn't find any literature research on before, like peer-reviewed evidence, is that California walnut woodlands are important to birds, and it's not just the tree; it's like the entire ecosystem. And that's the case that we have to maintain overall diversity of plants and health of an ecosystem together, not just one tree by itself. I think this would be very important, John, for your for Rakiza, for y'all to think about. I'm just reading. I don't know a lot about environmental regulation and how they apply it to black walnuts. And I've just from what I've read, for example, like in one report that, for example, like when you cut down a black walnut tree, you don't have to necessarily replace it with another one. You could replace it with an oak tree. So the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, is not applied the same to the black walnut tree as it is applied to other trees that are considered more imperiled or more important to ecosystems. So maybe, researchers, maybe people who are, interpreting the law can now look at this research and consider the importance of the black walnut and how we can't just cut down a tree and then not replace it with another one. But to be honest, John, I don't really know much about environmental law and how it's applied. That's like an area I'm hoping to get more experience with as I enter the job market. And then in terms of environmental, like I'm saying, your research, big takeaways from your research that impacts the developers versus environmental justice struggle. So I feel like, maybe I'm not really an expert in the environmental justice issues. I know that other people, like for example, people working with Elephant Hill in Northeast LA, I've heard Alva talk about how it's there's a lot of environmental justice issues here, and I feel like I would love to have a conversation, collectively. I don't think this is something I can answer by myself, John. And could I describe the Elria Canyon findings? My impression was that it may show us a way to develop communities with more intentional green spaces. I'm trying to understand the question.
outlier by itself? or
Uh-huh.
what Actions from that outlier, separate from this analysis, is there anything that you can describe that? That's fine. Like, so that it was strange, you didn't fit the models, but.
Yeah. Yeah, so like I had said earlier, I think that it would be interesting to do another research where we looked at spaces like Elleria Canyon, like have 8 sampling sites similar in size to Elleria Canyon, similar in urban density that surrounds it, to really be able to see any patterns. And but like as an outlier by itself, it's really hard for me to make any definitive answer about how places like Elleria Canyon what does that mean for all the other places like Elleria Canyon. Okay, and then the next question that John has is that foraging bird chart appears to be a more consistent food source. Is that what I'm understanding?
Like walnut is more consistent.
Yes, yeah, it is true. That's what I was trying to say. It is more of a consistent food source. Thank you for saying that articulately. Yeah.
Seasonal.
Yeah, seasonally consistent. Yes.
So, I have a question about just how you conducted the research day to day, a typical day of
Yeah.
what equipment did you bring? How long were you in under a bush? You know,
Yeah, so the question is like when I was doing my field surveys, like what was a typical day like? Was I under a bush? So my typical survey foraging on the day that I surveyed birds was usually 3 hours, maybe max 4 hours. And I made sure to survey between 6:30 and 11:30. No, usually by 11 or 11:30 was the cutoff. And I had a route that I always took the same route at each site I had the same route I would take, and I would walk, and I would maybe sometimes stand in an area for a few minutes, listen to the birds, wait for a while, and then when I think I was able to capture as many observations as I could in that one area, I would move on. But I would have to time it just so that way I could finish my route before 11:30. Yeah. But sometimes I would I would never spend more than like 4 or 5 minutes sometimes it would be 2, 3 minutes, sometimes it would be less. Like I didn't want to double count, So if I had already seen one bird, the bird that I thought I kept seeing over and over again, I had to move on. I didn't want to keep counting that bird. Yeah.
The alternative
Uh-huh.
is to kill.
Yeah, okay, so you have a question and then a Zoom question.
You have a lot of data about specific birds too, I presume, which are lumped together here. I'm wondering if you noticed any interesting differences in patterns between species in foraging preferences.
Oh, wait, where are my results? Sorry. Going back to the top 6 birds Okay, so for the birds, I had 49 species, over 1,000 observations, but then when you look at this count, okay, so 237 birds were bush hit, but then by the time I come to the 6th bird, it's already 38. And then so pretty much what I'm trying to say is that I didn't have enough bird observations to make any definitive I did try running models. I tried running models with each of the top 6 birds against each of the top 5 trees and shrubs. But then it wasn't really, most of them were not statistically significant because I just didn't have enough bird data, So like I did see actually maybe if I have to remember, yellow rump warbler came up statistically significant. I can't remember for which one. It was not a laurel sumac because I didn't have enough associations with that. I just didn't have enough observations. Yeah.
For what it's worth, on the same point with
marine benthic data we got by grabs. We have thousands of species, thousands and hundreds and tens of individuals. It was, even with a ton of data, it was still, the data looked just like this, that you just can't really ferret out the trends very easily. And you employ statistics to help you, but it's just natural systems are inherently highly variable.
Yeah. How do I get back to the chat? I saw a question in the chat. I don't know how do I make it come back? Oh wait, found it. Okay, so Jennifer, getting more, does Audubon Society advocate for policies to protect natural ecosystems for birds? I don't work for Audubon Society anymore. I cannot speak on their behalf. Maybe somebody here wants to talk about for Audubon.
Yeah, I'll talk, let me get next to the.
And then here's all the chats. Yeah.
So I recently went to an Audubon convention, and one of the things they're doing, instead of just focusing on birds, they're looking at the whole ecosystems and trying to figure out how we can increase the number of birds. There's been a huge loss of bird species, abundance, and presumably diversity was lost with that. And they want to do what they do. In the last 30 years, the trends have been going down on abundance and diversity, and they want to bend that curve and bring it up. This is where my thoughts about wildlife corridors come in. Wherever we can do is get native plants in. I have had no success in my little street where I live in getting, my neighbors to put in native plants. I know there's one gal who does, but she's got little kids that are busy roughhousing on the front lawn. But at least Audubon National and is encouraging all their chapters to do what they can to increase bird abundance and diversity. So it's an uphill battle. There's no doubt about it. A lot of resistance. I had a friend that we would go running at lunchtime, and I knew where the local native plants were, particular flowers, and he goes, well, why don't you just put in more ice plant? That's what really belongs here. And so it illustrated to me, here's a guy who's a biologist through school, works as a biologist, and didn't even recognize ice plant is a non-native. And it's an invasive, a harmful invasive, runs over everything.
Yeah.
So
we have
it's a
another
challenge.
question here. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Oliver, for your comment. Yes, very high R values. What made me personally interested in birds? I think like I started off as a plant person when I was younger, and then only became I was an amateur birder. I would still consider myself to be like an amateur intermediate birder, but like maybe really, really good at birds, specifically in this ecosystem. And I guess because my advisor, he's really into birds and that's what he's very knowledgeable with, I decided to run with the birds. I do think it's important. I think this is just like one area into wildlife that you could study within this habitat. Like if you look at coast oak woodlands, you know, there is a case to be made that oak woodlands are foundational species, meaning that if you remove them from the landscape, it will have a really, really substantial impact, disproportionate impact on wildlife because so much wildlife use it. So, but in order to be able to call it a foundational species, people had to really research how it's used across the food web system, how it's used by insects, how it's used by reptiles, and pretty much up the food web, you know, across the food web, across different taxa. So, you know, this is just like a starting point for this habitat, and hopefully I can pass the baton on and somebody else might want to study something else in the habitat. And then eventually we can really make a compelling case for California walnut woodlands in Southern California. It's just a matter of interests and of course funding and somebody who's somebody who wants to do it.
So one thing would be interesting is, well, it's been done a little bit with CalFlora.
Mm-hmm.
Say, if you want to find out what native plants will work where your particular yard is, you go to calflora.org and they will return a list of species that are suitable for your area. But to get an entire map of our counties in
Mm.
Southern California to pinpoint where various habitat types were, that would be a good starting point. That might be a good project for a grad student.
Yeah, and then what am I next? Like I said, I need to get a job. That's where I'm headed next. If somebody pays me to do more research on this, I would love to do more research. All right, should I thank you? So are we ready to transition? All right, thank you, everybody. Yeah.